in love with Rails and with Ruby, and have been using it ever since. So I've experimented with a number of other languages and frameworks, but nothing else holds a candle to Ruby. So anyway, as you mentioned, I designed a Ruby Conf India website. I'm sorry. Okay. Everyone can hear me now? Yeah. So you're probably seeing the RubyConf website. So I'll be talking about some of the techniques that I used while designing that. So today I'll talk about responsive design. So before I do that, a quick show of hands. How many of you like working with CSS, working with layouts and design?
There are two different questions.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So how many of you are responsible for writing or maintaining the CSS in your apps? Okay. And how many of you have started using Sass? Cool. Okay. Do any of you have maintain a separate mobile version of your applications, of your web apps? All right. Okay. So until recently, when designing websites, we only needed to worry about one resolution, around 1000 pixels, since everyone was accessing the net from their desktops or laptops. There were mobile phones and PDAs with browsers, but the screens were tiny and the browsers they shipped were just not capable of rendering most sites properly. So almost no one used them. This all changed a few years back with the launch of the iPhone. Suddenly here was a phone with a large sharp screen and a fully featured browser, and more users started accessing the net from their phones. But the experience was less than optimal. Here was a phone with a 3.5-inch screen accessing websites designed for screens 15 inches and larger. So what was the solution? The solution was mobile optimized sites. Many of us created special mobile sites just for smartphones. But these sites were generally built on a limited budget, so didn't have all the features of the main site. Plus, most mobile sites were built using mobile.js frameworks like JQ Touch. So all mobile sites basically had a same look to them. And maintaining two parallel versions of the site was time consuming. Basically, it was a pain. But it worked until now. Now we have to deal with this. We have screens, smartphones with screens 3 inches to 6 inches. We have tablets starting from 6 inches going all the way up to 10. And these tablets and phones can be rotated, either used in landscape or portrait mode. And we still have to deal with large screens, with laptops and desktops going all the way up to 30 inches. So what do? Do you maintain 3 or 4 different versions of the site like you are doing for the mobile site? Now that would be a nightmare to maintain. Or do you just ignore all the other devices, just deal with the desktop? See, sales of smartphones overtook sales of PCs in the last quarter of 2010, 2 years earlier than most people expected. And tablet sales are growing and will probably eclipse PC sales as well pretty soon. So ignoring these devices is not an option. And it's not just that, the mobile and tablet markets, they are growing so rapidly. There are so many opportunities in that field. So by ignoring them, we basically throw away a bunch of opportunities. Right. Next, what do? One option is to use a CSS framework. There are newer CSS frameworks with support for mobile layouts and desktop layouts, partially responsive. But these are generally rigid. You can only create layouts that the framework designer had in mind. So if you want to do something different, it's going to be really tough. Plus, you generally have only 2 versions, one for the desktop and one for mobile, nothing in between. And finally, using CSS frameworks means having to make a mess of your HTML, adding a lot of classes and adding elements as necessary as the framework requires. As Ruby programmers, I'm sure most of us pride ourselves on writing clean code, and this isn't something that I like doing. Okay, so then what do? Okay, so let's take a look at the RubyConf India website. Here are 3 screenshots of the site, 3 widths simulating desktop, tablet and mobile versions. As you can see, the site responds to the different widths and displays a layout that fits best according to the width of the screen. So how do we implement this on our own site? That's what I'm going to be talking about today. So for the sake of the talk, let's just focus on 2 things, on the menu and on the news articles. And here's the relevant markup. We have the container section page, then we have the navigation menu with which has a list of links, and then we have the news section which has a number of articles inside it. Okay, so when creating a responsive layout, one important thing is the widths of all the layout elements should change proportionally to the page. So as the size of the page or the screen decreases, the size of the elements should also decrease. How do we do that? First step, set all dimensions in percentages. Then the width of the element would change when the width of the page changes, because percentage is just basically a proportion of the whole page. Second, for a consistent layout, we need a grid. So if we want it, since we want it to be responsive, we need to create a flexible grid. So let's make a grid of 12 columns. Now why 12? 12 is a really good number to use for a grid, since it can be divided into 2, 3, 4 or 6 columns of equal width. So this gives us plenty of options for the layout. And secondly, we will be using media queries. Okay, media queries, this is a CSS3 module which allows us to target CSS based on certain conditions like the width or the height of the screen. So let's start. So we are taking a grid 12 columns. Let's make each column about 5 ems, and each margin between the columns will be 1 em. That gives us a total width of 73 ems. And here let's take a look at the layout. Here's the same layout that we looked at earlier, but with all the styling removed and just the layout boxes visible. Plus I've added the grid, the background, the layout grid in the background, so that we can see what's going on. So here's what we're dealing with: 6 links, 5 articles. Okay, so we begin with the links. The links, each link is spanning 2 columns here, and each article is spanning 4. Here's the markup again: the container, the menu and the news. So let's set the width of the page. Start with the page. The total width is, as we said, 73 ems. 12 columns into 5, 11 column margins and 2 page margins. Second, and this is the important thing, we set a max width of 100%. So as the page size, as the screen size decreases, the container will fit within that. So we will not have to deal with any horizontal scroll bars. And finally, the margin auto is just to center the container within the page. Right. Next, we have the navigation, the entire menu and the section for the news. It spans the whole page minus the page margins. So we'll add the page margins here. The calculations are simple. We have the margin is 1 em divided by the total width, which is 73 ems. Now why are we dividing it? Why can't we just put 1 em over there? Because as I mentioned earlier, all the dimensions should be in percentages. So we do that. We divide 1 by 73 and we get the percentage 1.370. Add that as the left and right margins. Next, the links. The link spans 2 columns. So 5 and 5 ems plus the 1 column margin in between, that's 11 ems. Divide 11 by the context here is 71 ems, since the width of the menu minus the page margins is 71. So we get 15.493%. And for the right margin, 1 by 71, you get 1.408. Lots of boring calculations to do, and even if you feel tempted to round up the numbers, please don't do that, because if you round up the numbers, your layout is going to shift by 1 or 2 pixels here and there, and your entire layout is going to break. Basically, if you round the numbers, bad things happen. Right. And same thing what we did with the links, we do with the articles. Each article, it spans 4 columns, that is 23 by 71, 32.394%, and the margin is the same as before. And that's it. We are done with the layout for the large screens. And since we set the width in percentages, as the page grows narrower, all the elements will also adjust. But this works only up to a point. Consider this: we have the menu, which is 15% of the width of the page. So on large screens, that's about 150 pixels wide. But on a smartphone, that 15%, that's less than 50 pixels, and that's too narrow. So when we are creating layouts for the other screens, we'll be using a media query. This allows us to specify conditions for the CSS so that the CSS won't apply unless these conditions are met. So here we are specifying screen, so this won't apply when printing the page, and we are specifying a max width of 800 pixels, so this will only apply to screens that are less than 800 pixels wide. And now on to the CSS. As we move to smaller screens, the columns in the grid become narrower. So to fix that, the individual content element should be made a larger percent of the whole page, or basically they should span more columns than before, so that the elements have, so that across the different layouts, the width of the element should stay pretty much the same. In this case, the link was spanning 2 columns. For the tablet layout, we will have it span 4 columns. And the articles were spanning 4, we will have them span 6 columns instead. So if you take a look at the links, they are still staying at a similar size on the whole. So that gives, so if we do the calculations are given over there. For the width of the links, you get 32.394%, and for the articles, you get 49.296%. And same thing for the mobile layout. Each link now spans 6 columns, and the articles span the entire 12 columns. You add the media query, max width of 640, and add these 2 things in between, and we are done. We now have a site that works on laptops, desktops, tablets, and smartphones. Simple, right? Now we are done with this, we go and show this to our client. And he says, hey, this looks great. One thing, there isn't enough space between the columns. Could you make the margins a little wider? What do you do? See, changing the margins, even just a little bit, will mean that we need to go and redo all of our calculations all over again. Now, for a small demo app like this, we just have links and menus, links and articles. It will just take us a few minutes. But imagine doing this on a production app, where you have hundreds of elements across several pages of the site. Making even just a tiny change like this will eat up several hours. And what if the client decides he wants to have another change later on? So basically the CSS is really brittle, and it's going to be a nightmare to maintain it and to make any changes to it. So then what's the solution? Is there any other option? That's where Sass comes in. You are, as I asked, many of you are already familiar with this. It comes as a Ruby gem, and it's also included with Rails. So it's basically CSS with nesting, variables, mix-ins, calculations, and other features added to it. And we'll also be using Susy, which is a simple grid system that is built on Sass. That is fully customized to your markup, your grid and your design. So you can use it as you want it. Basically, it gives you all the advantages of a CSS framework without any of the limitations or disadvantages. Plus it adds a number of other features. You don't need to change your markup to fit the grid. It fits according to what you need to do. So to get started, you add 3 lines of code to your gem file. If you are using it with Rails, use Sass Rails. If you are using it just plain Ruby, just the Sass gem will be sufficient. Run bundle install, and you are done. One thing, the Susy gem doesn't load the Sass files properly in Rails. So if you are using this with Ruby on Rails, you are going to need to add these lines to an initializer. I'll be adding the link to the RubyConf talk space, so you can by tonight. So by tomorrow you'll be able to have all of these things will be there on a page. So you don't need to note it down right now. Anyway, so the same thing that we did previously, we'll do it now with Sass. To get started, we just fill in a little bit of configuration info for this. Import Susy. As we mentioned, we are using a column grid of 12 columns. Each column is 5 ems, and the column margin is referred to as a gutter width. So that's 1 em, and the page margin is referred to as a side gutter width, which is also 1 em. And here's our markup, the same markup that we did earlier: the container, the navigation menu, and the news section. So to start, Susy includes a mixin for the container. So we add that in. This mixin will add the required width, the max width, centering the container, and some other features that will help deal with browser bugs. Just one line. Same with the menu and the section index. there is a mixin called full, since these are spanning the whole page. Add that, it takes care of the rest of it. Next, the links. So here's there's a mixin for columns. So we add that specifying that that the link is spanning 2 columns out of a total of 12. And here's where the nesting feature in Sass is so useful. Instead of having to write the media query somewhere else at the end of the file, somewhere else separately, you can just, in the same way how you nest elements inside other elements, you can also nest a media query right there. So in this case, we are adding a add media query, specifying a max width of 800 pixels and including that same line over here with a small change, 4 columns out of 12 instead of just 2. And another one, maximum 600 pixels, including column 6, 12. And all the CSS necessary for the links is done for all 3 layouts. With the articles, it's the same thing. You initially have it spanning 4 columns out of 12. For the tablet, it spans 6 columns, and for the mobile, it spans all 12 columns. And we are done. That's all the Sass. Let's around just over 20 lines to implement a responsive design with a menu and articles. And now, if your client wants you to change the width of the margins or the columns, that's not a problem. Just change the config at the very top, and the entire layout will be updated with the new calculations. That's it. You can try out as many different settings as you like and see what works best. Now, I'll be sharing a few more tips and best practices that you need to that you should follow when designing responsive designs. But before we get to that, from what we have covered, does anyone have any questions? Anyone?
Is it only Sass or is there anything else we can use? So there are other frameworks like Less and so on and so forth. So those
True, but there are probably similar frameworks available with Less. You would have to check it out. But Susy is built on Sass. So this particular grid system, you'll need to use Sass. And I'm focusing on Sass today since that is already quite widely used among the Ruby community. Yeah, over there.
Hi Arpan, I'm Jagdish. What exactly comes to the mind when we say it is responsive design? Is it all about catering a design which is flexible for all resolutions, all operating systems, all different browsers on different operating systems? So being responsive means what? I mean, a design which can flow to different resolutions, different touch interfaces, different interactive ways of dealing with the devices.
Yes.
So what exactly is responsiveness?
See, first thing is responsive design, as we are talking about it right now, is mainly dealing with different screen resolutions. But you can use this exact same techniques, and I'll be sharing few other things later on, which using media queries and using these features, you can develop a separate interface for a landscape mode and a separate interface for a portrait mode, for example. You also have options if you want to display different CSS images, like for the menu you have an image, icons. You want to have a different high resolution image for high DPI screens, like the smartphones and the new iPad. You can do that as well. But the main topic, responsive design, dealing with different types of screens. And you can also use this very same technique, use this very same thing when you are developing for making sure that your smartphone or your mobile layout is touch finger friendly. So you can use the same techniques, and I'll be talking about that also a little bit further on. Right,
So,
any other questions?
yeah, one quick question. So does it compile the CSS into a generic CSS, like a non-CSS3 compliant?
Yes.
Or like does it just include the mixins directly?
See, the Sass is a CSS pre-compiler. That is basically you write this your CSS and your styles in Sass. It is compiled down to regular CSS. But at media queries are a standard feature of CSS3, so they will not be supported in older browsers. So I'll talk about how to deal with that as well.
Thanks.
Hi, Arpan. Is the writing height and width in percentage is the only way to have responsive design?
Pretty much, because if you set it in pixels or in ems, it will stay a specific width. If you set it in the entire value of having a percentage is that it's a proportion of the whole.
Don't I expect to write browser specific CSS?
Browser specific CSS. You most likely will not need to do that, because most of the layout techniques that we are using work across all the browsers, and even at media queries are supported by all browsers including IE9. Older than IE8 and up below will not support media queries and some of the things. So you will have to add JavaScript if you want to support older browsers, but it's possible to support all browsers. So you don't need to write separate CSS. And what was the other question? That's it.
So let's say if I'm using Twitter Bootstrap or Search Foundation,
Yeah.
Do I need to use Susy, or those things are already inbuilt in those?
See, Bootstrap is pretty good, but its flexibility is limited. You can only do what certain things, and then you have to add a number of CSS classes based on what they need you to do, and the margins and all that are based on what the framework requires. Here you are basically free to create any layout, any grid, any system that you need and that you want to do. So you have all the flexibility. You have all the features that Bootstrap offers you. This gives you all those features plus additional flexibility.
I'll just add to that answer a bit. Like Bootstrap supports responsive layout, and you can customize the column width, the gutter width, and everything, and download a.
But does it support the last time I checked, it only has basically a layout for mobile and one for desktop.
Latest one, 2.0.1. It supports four screen sizes.
Fine. Okay. Okay. So let's continue. Okay. So I had mentioned earlier that Susy also has a number of other features. One of the things is it helps us in dealing with cross-browser compatibility issues. So if you're using this, it will deal with a number of those things. Plus, I'll share a couple layout gotchas that you might have to deal with. Let's say we have the menu, and we decide here to add a border and a background. When you reload the page, you're going to see this. Now, what happened to the background and the border? Why isn't the border around the entire menu, and why isn't the background visible? Does anyone have an idea about that? Yeah, so the clear fix has not been added here. So what's happening is because these elements are floated, they don't add to the width of the menu. So if you want to, you can add the clear fix which has a number of, you need to add an element and add a number of CSS lines, or Susy just includes a mix-in for this, include clear fix, and it will take care of all of that. So that's one. Here's another one. Here's the layout that we just designed. But if you actually loaded it up and looked at it in the browser, here's what you're going to see. This should actually, there should be 3 links beside each other, so it should be just in 2 lines. But the last element is wrapping to the next line. Now why is that happening? That's happening because we have given a right margin to each element. Now at the very corner there isn't space for a right margin, and so it's wrapping. So to fix that, here's what you do. You add, there's a mix-in called omega, which specifies that this is the last element in the line, and you can use the nth child, so every third element will be added as the last element, and it will fix that. Now here's one more thing that I want to talk about. Now I had mentioned Susy is built on top of Sass and Compass. So how many of you are using Compass? Okay, so many of you are using Sass, but most of your guests are not familiar with Compass. So Compass is built to be used with Sass. It's an open source, described as an open source CSS authoring framework. So at its basic level, CSS Compass produces, it gives you a huge amount of mix-ins that developers can use to reduce the maintenance of your CSS. For example, when you are in the site, you have rounded corners or box or shadows and other CSS3 effects. Now if you want to use it in your own code, if you are writing with CSS, you need to add a lot of browser prefixes. So you add -webkit, -border shadow, and then you deal with the border radius. So you have to, just to add one single thing, you have to add 4 or 5 different lines of CSS code. So Compass has mixins to CSS3 mixins which take care of adding all of those extra lines for you. In addition, some of the CSS3 features like border radius and box shadow have different syntaxes in different browsers. Like the border radius, if you are creating a border radius where only for one side of a box, the syntax in older versions of Mozilla in Firefox are different from the border radius syntax in WebKit. So all of these things are taken care of by Compass. So I won't be talking much about this, but I'd recommend that you take a look at it. You would probably, if you're writing CSS and using Sass, you're going to find Compass very useful. Okay. Now here's one more thing that you need to do when you're designing the site. The iPhone and the Android browsers, because they are expected to deal with desktop pages, they basically declare a width of over 1000 pixels so that they can display the full size browsers, full size pages. So, but in this case we have already designed our site to work properly for a narrow screen. So we don't want it to display the full large screen version, we want it to display the mobile version. So how do we do that? You add this line here, width, add this meta tag called viewport and add width is equal to device width. That will set the width to the same, and the initial and maximum scale, if you add those two options, it will prevent the user from zooming in, zooming out and ending up going into the large screen version of the layout. And this was another question that was asked earlier. What about dealing with different browsers? See, Internet Explorer 8 and below do not support responsive designs, they don't support media queries. So if you want to you can't just say I'm not going to support Internet Explorer anymore, because lots of users still use that. So the solution is to use a simple JS library like respond.js. It's a very small library that you just include it in your file, and it will basically add support for media queries in Internet Explorer. If you are using Modernizer, the newest version 2.0 already includes respond.js. So in that case you don't need to add anything else. Okay. So we have done the responsive design, we have done the layout, and now we open it in your browser, in your smartphone. What you're going to find is it's going to take a really long time to load. Now you'd think that this is a mobile optimized site. We are using small images for the mobile optimized site. So why is it taking so long? See, when using media queries, we mentioned that the CSS is applied only when the conditions are met, which means the CSS for the small screens does not apply to the large screen. And we would think the opposite would be true as well, but it's not. Remember, the CSS at the top that we added before the media queries, that applies to all the browsers. So if you have background images in your CSS in any of those lines, they are going to be loaded by the large screen, the desktop version. Those large images are also going to be loaded in your mobile layout. And you also have the media query for the tablet version, which specifies 800 pixels and less. So 800 pixels and less is also going to cover smartphones. So basically what's going to happen is the mobile phone is going to download the resources for the desktop version, the resources for the tablet version, and the resources for the smartphone version. Essentially it's going to download a bunch of resources that it's never going to use. And this is really, really bad, especially since most smartphones, the internet connection is going to be much slower, and most connections are also capped to the amount of data that they can download. So what do? The current best practice, the best way to do this is to design the mobile layout first. That is, all the CSS that we put at the end in the media query, that should come at the beginning, and then you add the addition flourishes or additional layout for the larger versions after that. So this way, even though the desktop version will end up having to download some of the mobile resources, that's not a big deal because those files are really small, right? And this way the mobile version gets just the files that it needs and your site will load fast. So that's just one thing. Starting with the mobile layout first gives us a lot of other advantages as well. one thing. The mobile landscape and the tablet landscape is growing really fast. So there are so many opportunities there. If you start with the mobile layout first, you are focusing on that, and that gives you a chance to see what other opportunities you might have. Second, it forces you to focus on the content and to prioritize what is really most important to your users. After all, you are dealing with a small screen. You have very limited space and you have limited speed. So you are going to have to focus on making sure that everything that you are designing, everything that you are doing in the site, all the content that is being displayed is what is important to your users. For example, if you take a look at many of the sites, let's say flickr.com, on the desktop the menu has about 100 different options. On the mobile they have about 5 options. So basically, when you are designing for the mobile first, you are forced to think about how your users are going to use it. And finally, it is easy to start with a simple layout and to add more complexity later and add more design elements and flourishes later. You start with something complex, to simplify it takes a lot of time. That's not easy. Here's a joke from XKCD. This is sadly true, right? Things on the front page of the university website, and those are the things that the people are actually looking for. The only thing common between the two, the name of the school. So when you are designing your site, especially when you are designing for mobile, you need to make sure that the content that you have is readily available and it is the content that the users are looking for. See, the needs of a user who is accessing for the site from the smartphone while he is outside on the go is going to be different from the needs of a user who is sitting leisurely at home and accessing it from the tablet or from the PC. So you need to make sure that as you are designing the different layouts, that you optimize or prioritize the content that is most important. Second, when you are starting with the mobile site, you are forced to make sure that you are optimizing everything. That means you use images that are compressed and that are just the size that are needed. You minify and gzip your CSS and JS to make sure that they are as small as possible, that they load as fast as possible. And when you are using, if you use any large JS libraries like Prototype or jQuery, try to avoid using more than one. And if you have to use, try to pull it from the Google Ajax libraries. That way the user might probably have it already cached on their device, so that your site loads that much faster. Also avoid requiring the use of plugins in your site, because most mobile browsers don't have support for plugins. So if possible, as much as possible, use HTML5 features if you need to use audio or video, and to support older browsers, have a Flash fallback for older browsers. Basically, embrace constraints. And this is another question that you had, finger friendly. When you are designing a site for smartphones and for tablet screens, when you are designing for larger screens, you have a mouse which is very precise. It can click on even a small tiny link. On smartphones and on tablets, you are using a finger to press and the finger is not very accurate. So you need to make sure that your layout is not just narrow enough to fit in the small screen size, but that anything that has to be clickable is large enough to be clickable with a finger. So links should be large enough, give enough padding. Don't crowd a bunch of links together so close to each other that the user trying to click one page goes to a completely different page. Also, it is possible there are a few number of new user interactions you can use, like drag to reload. If you see the mobile Twitter site, to reload or load new tweets, you drag the page down and it starts updating. So there are a number of new interactions that are possible that you can use. The mobile Facebook app, it uses, when you click on the link, it slides the stuff to the right rather than reloading the page or putting something on top. These interactions you can use them, but if you do use them carefully, because and make sure it is used in a way that the user can discover it. Because if you implement some feature and the user has no idea how to access it, you have basically wasted a bunch of time and made your site more confusing or frustrating for the user. Flexible images. You have a flexible layout, but if your content is not flexible, then you are in trouble. So if you have an element as it becomes narrower on the page, but your image stays large, so it basically jumps out of your element, it breaks your layout. So how do you fix that? One solution, you set a max width to all the images. So if you give a max width of 100%, then even if your element grows narrower, the image will always stay within the confines of the element block. Or else, if you don't want the image to be resized, you can set the parent element to overflow hidden. So this way the image may be larger, but the additional portion will be hidden. This still does not solve the issue that you are serving large images to a smartphone or to a mobile browser. This you will have to deal with in the backend. Now if you are displaying background images using CSS, then sure, you can use CSS media queries. But if you have images in the content itself, let's say you have a news article and a photo of a person there, that you cannot deal with in the CSS because you have no control over that. The large image, all you can do is make it smaller, but the entire large image is still going to be loaded by the browser. If you need to do anything, the only option is to do something server side, detect when a mobile browser is accessing your site, and give it a smaller image for that. That's the only option that you can if you want to make sure that you are serving a smaller image. Okay, up to now, any questions?
So I don't know what everyone else thinks, but I think it's not really helpful to draw conclusions about bandwidth from screen size. So because I could be on my tablet, but I could be on my home Wi-Fi network, or I could be on a 4G network.
True.
So secondly, so is there a way that you can have a layout that responds to the bandwidth separately?
No,
from
because
the
see, the CSS only has access to what the browser gives you, and the only media queries, that's the next. I'll show you what options we have available. As far as the bandwidth is concerned, there is no. If you optimize your site to be fast, it's going to be beneficial for everyone.
Yes, but so say I have a really fancy background, but I don't want to show it to people on slow connection.
You don't have an option to.
I think you can do that server side, like Google.
Okay.
No, but
Google Mail. You're opening it in a slow connection. It just will give you the older version.
Right.
Yeah, to detect I guess you would need to use JavaScript and server side thing to check the speed of the connection. You could do that, but that you won't be able to do that using Sass or CSS. That would have to be JavaScript and server side code.
The other thing I don't want to draw a conclusion about is whether it's a finger operated interface or a mouse operated interface. So how do I find out that?
If you are using, basically you assume that as far as the smartphone is, anything below less than 600 pixels is going to be finger based interface. That's the thing, we are designing for what is most common. But the CSS media queries are not going to give that. You would have to use Modernizer for that, and that's going to get complex. For this, see, we are generally designing for most users. So generally, if you are on the desktop, you might have the screen size little narrower, maybe not full size. I don't have it full size either, but very rarely will I have it all the way down to 200 pixels narrow or 300 pixels. But at the same time, see, being finger friendly doesn't mean that you have to make every box huge. You can have links that are small. Just make sure that there is sufficient space around the links, that you don't have 10 links that are almost touching each other. As long as the links, there is enough gap between the links, the browser, even the touchscreen browser, will handle it fine. It will click the link that's closest to the finger. So you don't have to have big boxes. Just make sure you have sufficient padding around the links. Okay, so the media queries that we are talking about, these are some of the options that are available to us. So we have the width. Most of these have the option of minimum width or maximum width. So you can specify that this apply the CSS if it is at least minimum width of 600 pixels. So it will apply to all browsers above 600, or maximum width, minimum width. We also have same thing for height. And then we have the device width and device height. For example, like you said, you might have resized your screen to a smaller size. The device width is going to give you the size of the screen device itself, not just the browser size. So if this is what you're looking for, that will give you what you need. Next, the orientation. You can, if you want, you can use that. If you want to customize the layout for a portrait or landscape layer mode, you can use that. Aspect ratio and device aspect ratio basically is similar to that. You can figure out whether it's landscape or portrait. And the resolution, I don't think it is very well supported just yet. But if you want, this would be useful for you now or in the future if you want to give higher resolution background CSS images for a high DPI phone, large, more expensive smartphones and the iPhone, the Nexus, or the new iPad. So you could use that, so that you can say specify a resolution of DPI width of more than 200 pixels per inch, and that will allow you to give higher resolution images for a high DPI screen. Here's another thing. How do we figure out what device the user is using? One of the things is identify the breakpoints. So if it is 300 pixels or narrower, it's basically a smartphone in a portrait mode. 480 pixels and between 320 to 480 will be probably a smartphone with landscape mode. So these are just a few that you can detect and design your layout accordingly. Just some assumptions that you can do, right? You can, because if you are using your user agents, you still have to design all the different layout CSS, except that in this case you just have a single CSS file that is displayed to all the browsers. User agent sniffing, you would basically give just the CSS that is necessary. But on the whole, if you compress your CSS, the amount of code that is in the media queries is going to be minimum. Plus, if you are not using user agent sniffing, it's easier to cache files since you are giving the same file to all the different screens. So you don't have to have anything in between the caching server and that. It's faster. Just a simpler technique. If you want, you can add user agent sniffing as well. So any other questions? All right. If you have any other questions, you can meet me after the talk. I think I'm out of time.